creating the world's best software, in my opinion. I think really what we're concerned about is not where the software comes from, not where the AI comes from, not about who really creates it, but about dependency. And we have this challenge of being dependent on companies from other nations. And that's an obvious challenge that everybody acknowledges. And what we need to think about is, what are the real concerns here? Is it that we have something from another nation? Is it this dependency? Is it risk? What is the concern? So in this panel today, we're going to get into some of this discussion. And from my perspective, I'll set the scene, and the panelists may well not agree with me. From my perspective, what we really care about is making sure that we can have access to the technologies we're using in our nation states, whether that's in the public sector or in enterprise. And for me, to do that, you open the technologies up. So let's see what the panelists think about this. And as I said, we've got a very esteemed panel today. We have Mishi Choudary from Software Freedom Law Center, and Mishi was the founder of Software Freedom Law Center. We were at an event last night together where she said we've known each other since 2008. She's very much an internationally recognized leader in open source and the legal aspects of open source. And we have Anastasia Stasenko from Pleias, an AI company that's open. From Paris. Anastasia is a bit of a force to be reckoned with, as you'll see as we go through the conversation today. We have Laura Gilbert, who I know from Number 10, where she was working on AI for Rishi Sunak's team and built I think it's the digital incubator in Number 10 before moving to Tony Blair Institute. And then last but not least, we have a gentleman on our panel today. We have Jimmy Wales, who you will undoubtedly know as the founder of Wikipedia. So coming to the panelists with the first question, I think I'll start with Jimmy since he was the last person I mentioned. And my first question this morning is about dependency, resilience and sovereignty. Now these are slightly different things. Where do you sit in that and how do we manage these?
Hello. I don't think my microphone is on. Hello. So, for me, one of the things that I'm super interested in and do a lot of myself is local large language models. So I bought the most expensive laptop that I've ever bought in my life with 128 gig of RAM and M4, and I'm very excited for the M5 to come out in the next few days, hopefully. And this is a new development because for many years I was like most people, I only need a laptop 2 generations old because I just get on the internet. I'm not doing photo editing or anything like this. Suddenly I'm like, oh, actually, this is really interesting and really important to have a really powerful processor because you can run local models that are just maybe 6 months behind the leading edge proprietary models. And this is really exciting for a lot of different reasons, and it does impact on all of these things. We've talked for years and years and years in the open source free software world about vendor lock-in and dependency and all of this. This is even more true in the AI era. There's also all of the enormous privacy concerns around, both at a personal level, people are using these things in ways that are pretty shocking. What people will tell to an AI bot that you would never ever consider telling some huge company, right? And for a lot of companies, there's a lot of proprietary information. Sometimes there are legal obligations around the data privacy. So this idea of having a very open, vibrant, open source community and people releasing models and new techniques and so on to reduce the amount of processing power, that has huge implications across all kinds of things and touches on, for example, sovereignty. So, for governments wanting to use AI, they may have a concern about using an AI that's controlled by one of sort of 5 or 6 huge companies. And they may say, no, actually, we really want to be really careful about that and not be locked into one thing. So, I think the encouragement of OpenAI, I don't mean to say OpenAI, but the encouragement.
That's the problem.
But the encouragement of open access to models is huge. And obviously, I come from the Wikipedia world, and you know, a lot of the things we're interested in have to do with diversity of culture, diversity of language, and obviously the big commercial models. They're actually pretty good at a lot of that stuff because they're just devouring all of the internet, but they aren't really focused on that. And I do think that that is something of actually great importance that we'll see in the next few years.
And Laura, you know, you come from a public sector background. Going back to that same question, dependency, resilience, and sovereignty being different things, where do you see this all fitting together?
I think, like you, I sort of instinctively recoil away from the idea of sovereignty. I'm just not highly nationalistic. But we are in a space where countries, I think, more and more do need to think about how they can have control over supply chains and be more resilient. And, you know, as Jimmy sort of alluded to, there is an element to which I think there is a real risk of loss of diversity if we are relying on only two superpowers to provide mostly commercial models, where you're going to get quite a high level of heterogeneity and sort of washed out of the system over time. If everybody around the world is using the same two types of model, it's going to be impacting not just sort of the language, but also the culture and people's identification with their history. And even on quite a small national level, you know, the idea of, does the model that you're communicating with sort of on a day-to-day basis understand for the Brits what tea means and how it can be supper as well as a drink? So it feels very trivial on some regards, but in other ways it's not, because you can lose your control and resiliency directly by losing control of your supply chain, by being very dependent on particular providers who can then cut you off or can be cut off from you by changes in geopolitics. But you can also lose your independence and sovereignty subtly and quietly and without really noticing it. And I think that we need to be really worried about that aspect as well.
I find that subtlety interesting. I've been around in tech a long time. I've done about 30 years. In fact, I've done exactly 30 years in the tech sector. And I think what we see is that whole piece with evolution that's got us to this point unexpectedly of having those big techs. I don't think anybody would have allowed this to happen if we'd had a crystal ball. Things would have been different. The difference is now we actually know how we got there, and we have to work that out and where we're going. Mishi, can I come to you with the same question?
Sure. So I was born in India. I aged in the US. I'm not sure how I feel about nationalism. But I do think that sovereignty doesn't mean solitude. You don't have to operate by yourself. You can build in collaboration in communities. I am the general counsel for a DC-based cybersecurity company, and when we are selling software, it doesn't matter who's buying. And as the lawyer who's served many of the communities, for whether it's the kernel or Apache or Debian, I have seen what collaboration across borders brings. And that also means that the boogeyman, which is China, oh, China should not do it first. They have also contributed a lot to making robust systems, and that only open source made it possible. I do also think that this is the Indian moment, because the hyperscalers are showing us one way of doing it, and that is also the elimination of labor. And the Chinese understand that the smaller models, inferences running on smaller devices, on low power in every device, is how they will do manufacturing. But they also manufacture political despotism. But we are here. Here, where enablement of minds, which is what open source does. It has helped us become the people who build things, whose minds are enabled because they give us the ability to solve problems together. This is why we need software tools that are making farmers and artisans more productive, helping students learn, helping doctors take care. And I do think that part of sovereignty means that your culture, your representation is not eliminated. You make these tools in your color. I don't lose my Indianness when I hyphenate it with my Americanness. I want all of those parts of mine to be existing. And similarly, when I think of these things as systems, not just systems of code and data, but systems of code, data, and human experience. Human beings doing things in the market, in the government, in the society, in the school. That's when I think about these tools, whatever we are calling them today, machine learning on steroids, large language models you're calling them, whatever it is. The most important thing is that people have to make decisions, and whether those are individuals who are developers or kinds of people who are users. In computer programming world, these days we do not know if it's a people or a machine or they're not distinct. We want us to actually grow up understanding that our minds are ours. And we make choices, and how our minds are used are our choices. And that's how I see sovereignty and enabling and using these tools to build for ourselves. And that's why I don't feel it is solitude. It is not about cutting yourself or protectionism.
Thank you. And you bring up a really interesting question there about China. And I think one of the very notable things about China is the scale of their contribution to open source and the shift in their policy. So that just hasn't happened overnight. China in 2017 shifted to an open source policy, and has not only shifted to a policy, but has built the necessary pieces in the landscape, from the Open Atom Foundation to hold code all the way across that landscape. And they just issued their next 5-year plan at the end of October. And in that plan, they're talking about how they continue with open source and build, from the position they're in for an economically successful future. And I think we have a lot to learn from how they've done that. And I think that's enabled a lot of their resilience. I'm going to come with the same question, Anastasia. You've got a very different perspective, I imagine.
Yes, quite a different perspective from a person who was born in Russia, a champion of sovereignty, and digital sovereignty actually, which completely annihilated the individual freedom. And as also a CEO and co-founder of a company which does create very small language models among the best, fully in open source, meaning that not only the weights and the code is open, but the data, the training data, which is actually the most important aspect of the systems, is open as well. And I do want to add 2 words which are important to me to the discussion. One is empowerment, and another one is competitiveness. And competitiveness here, when we're talking about the open source AI for enterprise, is a very important aspect and something on which we can actually build more resilient business models for open source AI. Because the current systems, such as Cloud Code, Cloud Cowork, Codex, all of these things, they obviously offer already huge gains in productivity for the enterprises. However, the fear that I'm seeing in the corporate circles, as well as for some more forward-thinking technologists, is that we are losing competitiveness by introducing the same exact tools, which actually completely get out all of our data, which is very specific to some of the business processes that we implement these tools for, and we actually lose competitiveness towards the other companies in the same sector as well. We saw how the application layer of the AI revolution, of the latest AI revolution, was one of the most funded and kind of the biggest one. Everybody was like, okay, let's build a cursor for X. Let's build a cursor, okay? And all of those wrappers actually now being being in direct competition with those companies on which they relied on for their models. Because if you actually push all of this kind of further, you see that the actual AI product is the model. the harness is important, the systems around are important, but the main capabilities are being developed inside of the models, and specifically during this agentic turn, which has been fully assumed, fully developed by the leading companies such as Google, OpenAI, and of course Anthropic. So I think that here the point is that what we really need to think about is competitiveness, and competitiveness can come in different ways. It's not only about doing the best model, it's actually doing the best model for and to. And for could be domain adaptation, but it means building sometimes from scratch. Yes, sometimes you do need to pre-train for specific industries. I'm sorry to say this, not everything is solvable through a llama or Quen fine-tuning, unfortunately. Sometimes it means adapting. Sometimes it's creating some more complex harnesses and systems, yes. The point here is that sometimes it's also about resilience in terms of hardware, how you can actually deploy those models. For example, the niche and what we built for is actually this very edge environments. Our models run on 8 gigaram computers. So, I mean, this is because like 8 gigaram is nothing, like compared to like basically what already Macs allow. But when you want to run a model on Android, and you want this to be offline, this is the kind of models you need, which are super small and don't require lots of memory. And this is also the case, this will be the case, you will need to have very, very small models when we actually pass at scale and when the processes are automated, just because of the sheer scale of the data we need to process, etc. And to finish with the empowerment. The monolithic models and the oligopolistic situation where you have a couple of companies all training on kind of the same data, most of which has been kind of stolen. Well, I mean, they already admitted it, right? So that's kind of also the point. If we want individuals to be truly empowered and to actually build what they want to build through the lens which is theirs, we need to create more capacities and opportunities for decentralized GI development, to give the communities and even further on the road, the individuals to power to develop their models. Why? Because those models are actually becoming the interface through which we interact with the digital world and with the web as well.
So I like this concept of empowerment and competition. And when Prime Minister Modi opened up the summit in Paris that you and I were at, he said access for all. And access for all, for me, means those two things. I don't use the same words as Anastasia, but I think about the ability of every person to access the technology for their benefits as tools. And then I think about innovators building and iterating on top of what's already there and creating competition. So I really like the way you summed that up. Just before I move on to the next question, Jimmy, you smiled when she mentioned data. Do you want a minute just to say something on the data before I move to the next question? Or we can wait till later.
No, it's fine. Yeah. No, so all of the large language models are very heavily trained on Wikipedia, and broadly that's a good thing. I always say, you know, you wouldn't really want to use an AI trained only on X. It would be very angry and would only fight with you. At the same time, all of our work, you know, if we talk about access for all, the original vision for Wikipedia is for all of us to imagine a world in which every single person on the planet is given free access to the sum of all human knowledge. So that is really fundamental to everything that we do. So it's our gift to the world, and we're happy that it's being used. At the same time, we are having some good success in persuading the large AI companies to work with us with our enterprise product. You know, they've been hammering our servers, which is expensive to us. And I only recently came to fully understand why. I was like, well, how many can there be? How many bots? Well, when humans come to Wikipedia, they tend to come, like the largest traffic is the huge spikes. So when the Queen died, millions of people came to Wikipedia to read the one page, which means it was cached in RAM. We just send it out to millions of people. It doesn't cost very much. When an AI bot crawls us, they hit every obscure page, and we need more database servers, more everything. So the cost is disproportionate, and the average donation to Wikipedia is just around $10. And those people are not giving to subsidize huge AI companies. They are giving to support our community and the efforts that we're making. And those arguments do carry the day. Like we've had a lot of success with a lot of the players. Google was the first, big anchor customer to say, look, like it is our gift to the world, but you should pay if you're using a disproportionate amount. Chip in. So that's really important to us. We are very different from a lot of publishers because a lot of publishers are trying to, they're worried about copyright and they're worried about, is this stealing our content and so on and so forth. I'm very cautious in that area because we know that, there is a certain kind of overreach that is very common with copyright and efforts to say, oh no, I have copyright, you're not allowed to do anything with that, which means impacts fair use and impacts scientific research and sharing knowledge and so on and so forth. So I'm a little cautious about that, but we're very different. Like we're just like, well, it is free. Yeah, you can take it. Just please don't smash our servers. That's not free. So, yeah.
And I like when you talk about a gift to the world because this is what open source. Oops. Oh, sorry. We just got a bit of furniture moving going on. Open source is very much our gift to the world, and one of the challenges we have is how that's funded and these shifts in ecosystem that move the balance of power and see companies making money out of the environments that we've created as that gift. And obviously the licensing, as Jimmy says, the copyright piece, we're quite liberal in our copyright, but there has to be some payback into that ecosystem. Conversation, I think, probably for another day. I want to go back to this conversation about resilience and think there's going to be a lot of conversation, I imagine, this week, particularly tomorrow in the Leaders' Day, around local models. And I'm going to ask the panel where those local models fit, if they think they're important, and if they are important, why are they important? And Mishi, if you're okay, I'm going to come to you first on this, because India's had a lot of talk about local models.
Yeah, I do think that...
Is the mic on?
Yeah, I think now it's on. So I think one of the interesting things about building these ecosystems is we did hack copyright law to then serve everybody. And that hacking worked because at least there was an agreement about certain rules that worked all around. Now, there is an agreement that pilfering is fine if you're a large, big hyperscaler and you're very rich. And then your CEO can come and announce, well, maybe we should rethink copyright now. So that does have an impact on how the communities maintain. I used to be OpenSSL's lawyer. The first time they approached me, I thought of that IKCD cartoon. They were literally 3 people. And I had to really ask them, are you just 3 people and this is OpenSSL and this is the entire internet? We didn't have resources. But it was so important for a FIPS 140-2 module, because that's what the US federal government needed, that we had to get them to some level to get resources in it. So I am very, very sensitive to the idea that freedom is created by a lot of communities that work together. Those bots which are coming to Wikipedia are not looking at Jimmy's face for donation all the time. And they're not looking at the ads, so nobody's looking at ads and that generation of revenue is being created to maintain those communities. Nobody's donating there. And those people are not going to maintain these pages and have those Wikipedia editing fights with everybody, which makes it such a robust system. And
Mishi, can we come back to models though?
No, but that's why I'm saying when we talk about local models here, especially when you're talking about here, I don't think we need frontier models for everybody. Every country doesn't have to get into the same game, and that's why the commoditization of certain underlying bases is so important. And that's why, from our conversation, the standards are important, whether it is the N2CP protocol or certain other places where we are, whether it's Goose or something else, where we are all building things together, then it helps. But the smaller models, like Anastasia was saying, like I'm a lawyer, I don't want to use Claude's legal plugin because I don't want that. So we will have something which is tailored to a certain specific thing. In India, we are now doing a public consultation of a data sets license where our own data sets are going to be used as the training models for smaller things. This is what we are talking about. You were talking about tea, and we can have that debate, of course, which tea is better. I do think Indian one wins. But I do think that it's an important subtlety to say that local needs, whether it is about language or it is about just the requirement, is something which is going to give us those smaller models, smaller inferences for sure. And the investments, that's why, have to be in basic infrastructure of compute and open standards so that people can adapt and build a much smaller one and not the large investments. Tomorrow, of course, as you rightly said, the discussion is going to be mixed about large investments in data centers and then how those models are going to get trained. But we will see the more open standards are built in, the more things get commoditized, the smaller the requirements and tailored for specific needs is what is going to proliferate.
And I totally agree with you, and I think there's often a missed piece in the conversation where people don't understand open source who are engaging with it. And it's that commoditization and how that actually happens. And it doesn't happen by telling people this is going to be how it works. It happens by the open communities choosing to adopt, and they choose to adopt what works for them. So you have to build that engagement with them to get what works for them. And I think that's really missing in a lot of what I'm seeing on the local level. Anastasia, I'm going to come to you with that same question about local models. Are they important?
100%. And I think that one of the main points was it the same for me about the copyright and about why we need more decentralized AI. It's actually about the share and the share of power which comes from AI. It's not about the fact that no, you shouldn't build something that will empower the humanity. You shouldn't develop artificial intelligence because there is copyright, or you shouldn't build something because other, like a specific other nation should be able to build the same. It's not about this, but it's about the fact that if we do not act now in terms of decentralization, and I'll explain what it would actually mean for AI development, we might finish in the society where the only political power in the situation where labor has been significantly changed. The only political power will be with those who own GPUs for data centers filled with geniuses. I'm quoting Dario Amodei, CEO of Anthropic here. No, but that's a real question, because there is a difference between the previous situation with open source and the current situation, because for AI models to run, whether they are open source or not, you need the physical reality of the energy and the GPU. So this changes everything, because now we can have open source models. They can be amazing. If we do not have the compute enough to run those models, they don't serve anything, and it's really important point. So when we are talking about local models, I'm not seeing the other way at this point of how we can actually build more decentralized AI, how we can share the value created from the AI revolution in better, more equitable ways than doing very small. Because, okay, there is compute. Let's think about another shortage, which probably some of you are gamers, and you already know that it's almost impossible now to build your own PC because the memory is so expensive. Okay, so there is memory, there is compute, and the only way is to miniaturize, to go down, so that the local models can empower not only nations but the communities, the enterprises as well, in order to claim actually the value that this AI revolution can produce. So, and I really want to tell you a small anecdote, which kind of will explain why I'm so obsessed with this. 2 years ago, Pleias was at the beginning of the first sovereign AI co-pilot of the French government. Okay, so we started working with the government, and they wanted this to be based on open source quite immediately. This was the time when Falcon and Llama 2 first came out, was the first open source models with commercial licenses. And they wanted, you know, in France there is this idea of equity, so that basically if a public servant gets something to improve its work, another public servant should kind of also get it, right? So you cannot just empower one public servant and forget another one. And so the beginning of the project, okay, it's a proof of concept, it should serve 15,000 people. And everything we got in terms of the GPUs were 4 GPUs. So we were like, cool, yeah, let's go. Like back in the days, like all of these models were even very bad in French, to be fair, right? Like so, like, and we started doing the 7B models because this was the only way we could actually serve. So this was the POC. How many actually public servants are there in France? 6 million. Wow. How are we going to serve? No, but like for real, like because it's interesting to talk about like, okay, yes, we can have Claude Code, we can have like Le Chat by Mistral, whatever, but the actual costs and the actual value generated, like let's just compare those things. So this is why if we are real believers in the AI revolution, like this will be the industrial revolution, we need to think of local models right away.
So I think that's a super interesting answer, and it's slightly sidetracking, but data centers have come up twice now. We have somebody from Nscale in the room who are working in the UK in this space. And I was in China, in Beijing, in December with the open source community there, and they were talking about compute. And what I learned is that Chinese AI engineers are obsessed with building lean, small technology because they don't have the same access to compute. And the more I listen, the more I'm hearing that this is where we're driving. And I do wonder about these giant data centers we're building that are costing so much money, requiring so much energy, and potentially so unfriendly to our environment. You know, when we think about people, power, planet, the 3 chakras of this summit, whether those are where we should be driving. But I'm sidetracking the conversation slightly. I want to come to Laura, who has worked in the UK in the public sector. Not small models. I am slightly obsessed with small models, sorry. Sovereign models. What do you think?
Well, I mean, you come back to the original define sovereignty. You know, local and specific models are really going to underpin our ability to operate going forward. I was interested in your point on competition, actually, and this is a bit of a segue, but I promise I'll bring it back around. Competition itself is very different than it used to be in the tech space. The AI value chain is so complex that we're no longer in a space where it's a zero-sum game, and this one company can provide, you know, one type of product and service, outcompete another one and win. You're very much in a space where what you're seeing commercially is that the companies that succeed tend to be forming really strong partnerships, and they tend to be able to pick up and flip out members of that partnership to meet specific needs, you know, worldwide. And we need a very similar approach when it comes to the public sector, where you can flip out your models. And this is, for me, a lot of the power of the open source sort of community's impact on the public sector. It obviously opens up new opportunities, but it also creates a new sort of ecosystem. So the thing I care about most is reducing inequality. And much like, you know, with the sort of AI solutions in the tech space, where we're in a world where it's not zero-sum, where the right collaborations can drive much greater overall sized pies for everyone to sort of, you know, go and benefit from. In the public sector, the more open source solutions we get out, and the more you can flip in a different model to meet your local needs, but still, you know, produce something, we have the real opportunity to reduce that global inequality and become just across the world safer, with better health outcomes, better educational outcomes, a basic minimum standard for everybody that rises up. And in creating these sort of open source collaborations, you obviously break a lot of the grip of certain nations on certain parts of the supply chain. But you also enable the spinning up of new sorts of companies. And what we see in the government space is that when you have really good open source solutions, and what I did in the British government was create a lot of those, and they get picked up worldwide, you put in a new local model that's relevant to your context, but you also drive the creation of a lot of small companies in that local region who can spin that up and deliver that solution into the public sector really quickly. And it's a different kind of company, a different kind of collaboration. It potentially even gives you a little bit of the answer to what do you do when a lot of people lose their jobs through certain types of AI adoption? Well, you create a new ecosystem that enables better delivery of public sector, more companies doing things more efficiently in more local spaces and meeting the local user needs and enabling us to get to that point where the kind of governments that couldn't afford to pick up this kind of technology and couldn't afford to serve their public the way we like to can suddenly get involved in this space and drive their own ecosystems. I think it's hugely powerful, and local models really need to underpin that.
Thank you, Laura. You almost said a phrase that we use as a bit of a cliche in open source, which is a rising tide lifts all boats. And I really think that's what we're achieving with this. I don't always agree with the UK in terms of our policies and our legislation, but I very much do agree with our roadmap. And our roadmap said that in terms of sovereignty, the UK would not be isolationist. We recognised our collaboration partners, and in fact, when it comes to open source, the UK is India's second biggest collaborator, despite our relatively diminutive size and your huge open source community. So Jimmy, can I come to you with the same question? Local models, sovereign models, what do you think?
I mean, I think I did already cover that pretty well. I mean, I think that it's really important that we see the growth of and the support for local models because of all the reasons that we've talked about. So I'm not sure I have much to add at this point.
So I'll stay with you then for the third question that we've got. We've seen a huge amount of geopolitical shift in the last year, and I'm probably more sensitive to it than most people because the UK used to be part of the EU. We Brexited 6 years ago, and a lot of our collaboration has become very difficult because of that with the EU. It's getting better, but there was a reaction to that shift, and I can pinpoint it to a second in time when it happened. Over the last year, there's been so much conversation about geopolitics. How do we surmount that? How do we create an environment where we're able to continue to collaborate cross-border despite all the things happening across the planet?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is like the world of what goes on in politics and the different, very difficult times. When I look at the Wikipedia community, right, people mostly don't pay much attention to all that. I mean, thank goodness, right? With all the culture wars and the creation of anger between different groups of people, what we still see is fantastic friendships across borders, friendships across very difficult borders. Sometimes there's a few quarrels around things that have happened and so forth, and people emotions can be quite high. But broadly, I think the same thing is generally true across technology. Open source communities, they have their like us, they have their own internal dramas that are probably more dominant than which country you're from. It's sort of like which code editor are you using? That's a religious war right there. And so, I remain very, very optimistic about human beings. People really do get, like, we are all humans. We are all here on this planet. We have the opportunity to do amazing, exciting, fun things together. And there's people out there who are generating anger and discord, and I don't think the social media algorithms are helping. They're actually hurting in all of that. And so, I just think we all need to sort of stick to those values of saying, like, we're all here, let's make amazing things together.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come to Anastasia, who probably has two perspectives, one living in France and one as France is part of the EU. And from an outsider's perspective, looking in on the EU, they are very, very nationalistic at the moment about sovereignty. They recognise that you can't build sovereignly, whether it's software or AI, without using open source, because you need that as your cornerstone. But I always feel quite concerned about this attitude that is going to try and localise open source. So I'd be really interested in where you're seeing that and, you know, your thoughts on it.
Oh, 100%. 100%, and there are some countries which are already more nationalistic than others. The one which is trying to put the label, the regional label on its own tech is France, because we are supposed to be parts of the French tech, which I'm always a bit cringed about. I'm sorry to say this word, but I specifically when what is trying to be promoted is open source. Open source for me is by definition something that requires the collaboration of individuals, and this is actually how it has always been built. Very let's say, opinionated individuals either contributing to the Wikimedia community, to the larger open source community, including software. So I'm definitely saying this, and it does really scare me. Why? Because I have already seen this play out in Russia, and it has finished as being extremely isolationist and very undermining both for the local communities as well as their inclusion in the broader global open source and tech community in general. So for me, this is not the path, and I do totally agree with the fact that we should double down on the open source and not on the sovereign usage, weaponization of open source. Then, once again, for us, for example, as a company based in France, we have more ties, more collaborations with the organizations, with the companies, with the communities based outside of France or even outside of the European Union. This is very paradoxical because, I mean, it makes kind of sense to work locally, right? We were talking about local models, and some of the collaboration should be local, but it just happens out to be so that we connected much more and created many more collaborations and things with the people who have reached out to us on Twitter, unfortunately. Once again, there is this, or with the community, specifically Wikimedians. We are very close to that community, or Mozillans, and etc., etc. So the point for me is that we really should focus not on the flavor of the open source, but actually on the open source itself and what creates its nature. When I'm talking about flavor, I don't think that we need to be concentrated on that it is French or German or British open source. Because this kind of, for me, this undermines the very definition, and it undermines the outputs that it actually gives. Because, for example, the European Union has kind of heavily funded some of the AI open source developments. And I must say that due to the fact that it was always presented not as open source and putting upfront, not presented as open, but not putting upfront some of the benefits for the open source community, you know, because like when, for example, Chinese models come out, they really put up front some of the architectural differences, you know, some of the things that open source enthusiasts can actually use, you know, even themselves, based on the papers. When you see open source EU projects, it's all about, yes, we have done the most European model on earth. Wow, cool. And what about like people, for example, in India, like one of the regional communities that we, for example, exchange the most with, what about them? Like, should they be concerned by this, or just like, for me, it's open source washing, and this is what I hate the most, to be fair.
And it's really interesting that it's a different kind of open washing that's just evolving. I sometimes call it local source, not open source. And I had no idea that was going to be your answer. So I gave them the questions before, and it's not what I expected.
Sorry.
And I'll tell you why it's not what I expected. A very old friend of mine, who I think is a hero of open source, was with me 2 weeks ago in Brussels, and I said to him, "What have you done?" And they're now building this sovereign stuff. I said, "What have you done? You've sold us down the river." And he said to me, "Amanda, sometimes you just take the money and do what you have to." And I was so shocked. I really was, because this is one of my heroes. You know, they say never meet your hero. Here you go. Laura, any thoughts?
Always. Yeah, I mean, so the geopolitical angle is very interesting at the moment, and of course you've seen some really major changes, and the one that's impacted me has been the change in the position in the American administration. And this struck me first, sort of straight in the face. A couple of years ago, I was in Canada speaking at the Vector Institute conference, and it was the same day that the tariffs hit Canada. So I had the privilege, a very rare privilege, being in a room full of angry Canadians that you don't usually get unless it's ice hockey. They're all
that's not really
furious.
their style, is it?
Yeah. And so sort of across Canada, people were pulling American products off the shelves, and they're very, very upset and very angry. And I was also upset, not so much about the tariffs, because not my circus at this point, but I was upset about the changing positioning, because what we were hearing out of the US, and it reflected very quickly, although at a much smaller scale in the UK, was we don't care about safety anymore, we care about security. Safety includes aspects of diversity, inclusion, fairness, bias, and security doesn't. And in fact, pressure on US companies actively, and US organizations